Okay, so let's go ahead and get started now that we've given an opportunity for everyone to join us. Good morning and welcome to the challenges of leading a community in the age of COVID-19. My name is Amy Sanchez and I'm the Vice President for our Condo HOA division within First Service Residential. And today I'm joined by my panelist, Aram Arsalanian, who is the President and CEO of Cadence Learning and Communication. Throughout this webinar, you may hear from my colleague, Eleanor Goldstein, who will be providing technical support in the background. Most of our webinars to date have truly focused on getting our communities to operate under COVID and really providing safety mechanisms for our associates to continue working, as well as our homeowners and board members. Today's focus is going to shift a little bit away from property operational needs and focus a little bit more on what's going on with us internally. At some point during this pandemic, most, if not all of us, have experienced some level of fatigue, exhaustion. And the reality is that that's kind of to be expected. I mean, our social, professional, and even our personal lives have changed a lot. And all of that change truly impacts us both in obvious and not so obvious ways. As an organization, we understand the value in addressing the psychological well-being of our associates. And today, we're going to be taking those concepts and really talking about them a little bit further for our board members to take hold of that information. And together, we can use that to provide a better level of service for our homeowners and our communities alike. And so we've brought Aram here to help us explore what's going on behind the scenes from a human perspective so that we can recognize some of our own behaviors and even thought patterns that possibly might be leading us to a path of burnout. So Aram, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Amy. So everyone, my name is Aram Arsalanian, and I live in Vancouver, BC, Canada. My background is as a therapist. So I spent a decade working in Vancouver, BC's not-for-profit sector as an addiction and mental health therapist. So I started my career working with street gangs and street entrenched youth, so young people living in extreme poverty with like high levels of violence and stressors. Then I moved into concurrent disorders housing, so providing housing for people who are typically have challenges with maintaining housing. And finally, I moved into adult addictions and mental health, where I did a lot of work. And in that space, I was exposed to people who lived in poverty, people who had, very, very wealthy, the whole mix of different kinds of people who were struggling with those same ideas of addiction and mental health. After 10 years, I decided I wanted to take my background in psychology and apply it to a different kind of pursuit. And the work that I do now is still from a therapeutic space, but instead of working with people around addictions, I'm working with people on how to show up as leaders, how to maintain great, strong, healthy work cultures, and also how to partner with people just like you every day about saying, if I'm going to work with people, whether it's in a workspace or community setting, how do I create the healthiest space? How do we do things in a way that promotes health and well-being and positive critical thinking, rather than falling into patterns of self-harm or community harm?
Thank you for that background. Well, that plays right into kind of having a sound understanding of what it is that we're experiencing, right? I mean, there's been so much shift thanks to COVID. Our lives have completely adjusted. And the reality is that I think that we can all agree that that's somewhat where we're at. But while we have these things that are going on, we're experiencing different behaviors, not only with ourselves, like, the concept of being a little extra irritable or on edge. There's a lot of that that's going on that I think we can recognize, but translating that in how we partner and work with other people, that's when it starts to become a little bit more vague. And so I'm hoping, Aram, that maybe we can explore a little bit further, taking all of that that's going on in our world, within our communities, and talking about, where is this irritation coming from? Why are we just so irritable all the time?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff we can talk about here. I want to give some very basic concepts. The first is the idea of othering. Next, I want to talk about emotional labor and how that plays in. And then finally, in our conversation, I'd like to talk about long-term stressors, the long-term stress response, and then how we can take care of ourselves so that we can show up the best way and enable the best conversations. So othering is something that I believe that we should start with.
Sounds like a great place to get started. Okay, what is othering?
It is. It sounds like some totally like floofy modern term, but it has its roots in really deep psychology. So have you ever noticed that if you're in a workspace or in a community setting, sometimes people just take liberties and they make assumptions about why we do things, or they'll say, you're this way. And they'll just say something about you. We're like, oh my gosh, what would make you think that I'm like this?
Yeah, not me.
Right, totally. So the thing about this is it's not something that just a few people do. Many of us, maybe most of us, or even all of us do some version of this, which is called othering. That we take either very, very positive traits or very, very negative traits, and we put them on someone. And in doing that, we either make them like these superhumans. Think about like celebrities where we're like, they must be so amazing and such good people. And then people are often very shocked when something in the media comes out and be like, I thought more of them. Well, why? We don't know them. They're just a person on TV.
Right.
Or we take, especially with people that we have challenges with in the workplace or the community, we put traits on them and view them in these very negative lights. And in doing that, we're actually kind of stripping away their humanity. We're making them almost these caricatures of behavior. So for example, oh, so-and-so, they're a bad person. Okay, if we say someone's a bad person, we're othering them, because what we're saying is they're a bad person. But what we're really saying in the background is, and we're a good person. We're not like them, we're different. And here's the thing, for almost every person that's on this, we have lots of people that think we're good people, that love us, they care about us. But I would bet most people on this have had a couple rubs with people at work in the community, could be an ex-partner, whatever, that's like, that person's a bad person. Depending on who we interact with, how we interact with them, what's going on in their life, what's going on in our life, we're going to have a combination that can lead to us making these snap judgments about people and saying, this person is like that.
Absolutely. And I think all of us have found ourselves in that situation on both ends of the spectrum, right? So the way that you encapsulated that with, celebrities, absolutely, we've all done it. I've certainly done it. And then on the negative side as well, getting prepared for a board meeting or entering into a team meeting, and you somewhat take, Aram, you've historically introduced us to the concept of detractors, people who aren't positive leaning, and we somewhat put them in a category already becoming defensive of, they're not going to be open to my ideas and suggestions, so on and so forth. So I could see now that you're mentioning what othering is, how that comes into play in our day-to-day lives as we're operating these communities. And so when we other them, well, go ahead. I didn't mean to take away from you.
Well, we just got a great question. So how does this relate to like the challenges of managing these communities? And when we are at our best, just in general, we other people. It's a very normal part of the human experience. When we're at our worst, when we're at our biggest challenges, when we're being really pushed very, very hard, it's very easy to make snap judgments about people. And those judgments, the ways that we view people, prohibit strong communication, prohibit coming together to work as a community, prohibit problem solving. And it can take something that is, let's say, a small problem in a community, and it can cause people to take sides. It can create mini civil wars within a group of people, because people feel they need to take sides, and there's no better way of taking side when you other the other group and you think, gosh, like those people are like this. And we see this about all sorts of arbitrary things. We see this about sports teams. We see this about like all sorts of things. In a time like this, in a community setting, it is really easy to lose our connection to our neighbors, especially if we are in the space of being a board member and people are coming at us with complex issues that they're very upset about. And we can make them something in our heads that they're not. So they can do that to us and we can do that to them. And why this relates is this is about awareness about how we can hold up a mirror to ourselves and a mirror to other people, so that we can always return to, of course we can work together. No one's a bad person here. We're just people trying to figure out a very challenging situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, our goal is to create some level of unity, right? We've got to gain alignment with our board members, alignment with our management team, and certainly the goal would be to communicate what it is that we're trying to achieve at a property level, not only communicate that, but that then of course brings unity in and of itself, because then people are aware of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So you've described this level of othering, and I think we can now put some level of context to how we might be doing that. But then it leads into some level of stress that continues to go on behind the scenes, right? And so what I mean by that is we seem to just be constantly tired. There's always this process of having to manage and our emotions and things along those lines. So how do we fold that into how we manage our emotions? What is it that's going on there?
Yeah, so around emotional, like any kind of emotional reaction. So let's say that we're in a community setting or a work setting and someone yells at us. We all know it's totally inappropriate to yell at people. It's not the space to be. And we also know it happens, and it's going to happen now. So if people on this in this session, they've very likely experienced that, or they might experience that. So the reason we talked about othering is when you get yelled at by someone, very often human beings, and from the most basic place, we look at things from a position of patterns. We always want to do pattern identification. And the most basic pattern that we have is safe and dangerous. Something is safe, something is dangerous. We of course know there's like so many nuances to the world and human interaction. So when we think about emotional management, we have to understand that the core of emotional management is how we feel about the person we're interacting with. And that's why we want to try as hard as we can from othering people, because if we look at them as dangerous, that means we're going to have a hard time interacting with them in a consistently positive or thoughtful way. So let's talk about emotional management. As a group, you might have heard the term emotional labor before. And this is like, again, it's like this, it sounds like this really modern kind of Pinterest term, but it is really rooted in very classic psychology. And the simplest way of looking at it is if all of us are driving down the road in a car together or a big van together, and someone cuts us off, and they cut us off in like a scary way, we are going to have an emotional reaction to that. But me as the driver, I don't want to freak everyone out if I'm driving. So I don't want to start yelling and screaming and chasing the person. If I did that, I would be causing harm because everyone would be afraid. So we all have an emotional reaction, but me as the leader in the situation, because I'm driving, I have to take that emotional reaction and I have to push it down. And I could choose to push it down entirely and just not acknowledge it at all. Or I could push it down and then express an appropriate version of it for the moment, which could be like, whoa, that was really scary. Is everybody okay? That would be an appropriate way of expressing it. So that effort it takes to push down that emotional reaction and either push it all the way down or just push it down enough where I can let out the appropriate version of it, that takes work. It takes a lot of effort to do that. And that's called emotional labor. By nature, it sounds like a negative thing, like, oh my gosh, labor. No, like think about the time where you're, in the grocery store and someone does something rude in the lineup. And instead of like taking a tomato and throwing it at them, you calm yourself down and you just continue. As human beings, being a human being in the world is messy, especially if we're talking about like your community where you live. Of course, it's going to be messy. And there's all sorts of things that are provocative in nature. They can make us have an emotional reaction. And our ability to decide whether or not we express that or how we express it is the labor. And it is the most normal part of our day-to-day.
So I love the examples that you gave, right? Because all of us can appreciate and or relate. We've been there in the car, we've been there at the grocery store. And to take that and apply that to what our board members have also experienced. We've also been in those board meetings where even whether or not it's in person or in today's day and age, we're connecting via Zoom, where you have the one person who's constantly sending messages in the chat, right? Trying to disrupt the meeting, or they're vocalizing during the meeting. And so the way that we choose to react to that, it sounds like the coin term there is that we're choosing to implement this concept of emotional labor, whether we know it or not. We're managing our emotions or how we choose to respond to that. And so for sure, we can see some reactions where some of us are better at keeping some level of control and consistency with that. And then some of us are not. And then we've also experienced where some of our team members and associates and board members might typically be very good at it. But right now, for whatever reason, there's more people who are agitated across the board. And so being able to, there's a lot more opportunity where we have to control that more frequently, that it becomes a little thinner, right? Our skin gets a little thinner in trying to manage that process.
Yeah, and if I
Absolutely.
can add to that, so emotional, if we look at anything we do, things either come from an ability. An ability is something that's natural to us, or a skill.
Mhm.
A skill is something we learned. And you can have an ability and not hone that ability. So you don't make that ability stronger than it is. So some people are just naturally athletic, but it doesn't mean they all become pro athletes. Some people are naturally athletic and they do hone it and they focus on it. And then there's skills. There's skills that you learn that maybe you don't have a natural leaning to, but you work very hard and you learn how to do it. So our ability to mount emotional labor can either, you can have a natural ability or a skill or a combination of both. But we all have different amounts of an ability to manage emotional labor. And I'd like everyone to think about it like this way. So imagine holding a dumbbell, and the dumbbell is straight arm away from you. So you're just holding that weight at a straight arm. Either from your skill that you've learned or your ability that you've honed, everybody has an amount of emotional labor they can manage at any given time. And so it might be 2 pounds, it might be 5 pounds, it might be 10 pounds, it might be 20 pounds. Whatever it is, you can hold that amount of emotional labor and you can manage it. In a time like this, so in general in our lives, our emotional labor, we want to either manage that emotional labor, and we do that through self-care practices. So managing emotional labor isn't about reducing weight. It's about saying, my arm's getting tired and I'm going to move the weight from one arm to another arm. Now this arm is fresh. I can let this arm rest. I can still hold the weight. And then when this arm is rested, I can push it back. That's managing emotional labor. Or we can pay emotional labor, which is a little bit more complex. And if we have time, we can get into it later on. But the whole idea is when we're at our best, we can either manage emotional labor or pay emotional labor. In this time right now, most human beings in North America and in the world are experiencing a much higher and much more consistent amount of emotional labor. So if you're used to, say, carrying 15 pounds, suddenly you've got 16 pounds or 17 or 18, and your ability to move it from one arm to another is either stymied because maybe your self-care has to do with lots of socializing or lots of exercise or any of the things that might be difficult to do right now. Or maybe you can do all of it, but you're moving from one hand to another and you're still just getting exhausted. The thing is, there's more emotional labor. It's coming more rapidly. That means we're getting tired. And the harder it is to hold up, the lower the weight goes. And when it goes all the way down, our ability to interact with people as our most consistent and best selves is greatly reduced. And that's why we're seeing a much higher amount of emotional reactions from people. So people who are naturally, who can't carry a lot of emotional labor, let's say they can only carry 5 pounds and they're quick to express themselves in an angry or a dismissive or a negative way, we're probably seeing a massive uptick in their behavior. People who are usually very good at pushing or positioning themselves well, they can't do that right now, or they're doing it a lot less. And that means they're becoming either much more expressive in a way that they don't like, or they're becoming much more avoidant. So they're becoming totally silent and distant because they don't want to be in that space with people.
Absolutely. So as you're talking about these concepts, I'm envisioning a person who's got a bunch of spinning plates, right? I know you gave us the visual of holding up a weight, but at the same time that we're holding up weight, there's in the background all these spinning plates that are going, right? And so you've got somebody who's constantly going between the two of wanting to still affect business and in a fluid and efficient manner, but then having to exude this extra level of emotional labor. And so I could see where when you've got that, the behaviors might shift, and then we might fall into this category of starting to other people, right? And how we respond to them. And you take all of that, and this is going on for an extended period of time, right? I remember a couple of months ago, we were talking about this maybe just being like a 3-month period of time or a very short period of time. And that's somewhat evolved into here we are 6 months later, 7 months later, and we don't really have an expert opinion on when is this going to end. And so to that, we really need to start hunkering down to the fact that this might, and from an emotional perspective, continue on for several months. So to that, I mean, I would imagine that there's some level of erosion and also needs to start preparing for that long-term stress situation.
Yeah. And so here's a good space to talk about the long-term stress response. So human beings by nature are not intended to be in stressful situations for long periods of time. It's not good for us, and it's not good for our psychology. It's not good for our physiology. However, we are a miraculous species, and we do have a backup system to manage this, but it requires caretaking. And I'm going to encourage people that in your communities, you are seeing people from a basic space. They don't know how to manage this, and they are going over the cliff of exhaustion. And when they get there, they've got no ability to manage their emotional labor. They're burnt out, they're aggressive. You're going to see a spike in behavior. So I want to talk about these three spaces and how to maintain your health in it. This is very much like when you're on an airplane and you're getting ready for takeoff. They tell you like, hey, if the masks come down, put on your mask first. And for anyone who has kids on here, I know that I think whenever they say that, it's like, no, I'm going to put my kid's mask on first. That's because most of us want to take care of other people in times of stress. I'm going to encourage everyone here. The best way you can be of service to your community and the best way you can be a solid board member is take care of yourself first in terms of health. So when I talk about this long-term stress response, I want you to share this with your friends, your family, your community. You can take this recording, you can blare it up on the loudspeakers, whatever you want. What I'm going to talk about is stuff that I've developed through my practice, but I don't mind at all if it's shared with people. It's about keeping us intact as individuals, but also as a community and a society. So our long-term stress response is three areas. The first is alarm. And this is intended to be a short-term response. And this is dominated by our sympathetic nervous system, so our fight or flight. So it's when something scary, like terrifying, worrying, something that makes us like angry or defensive happens. And our sympathetic nervous system kicks in and it dumps a bunch of cortisol into our system, like a stress hormone and adrenaline. And we're ready to fight or to run away. Now, the thing around the sympathetic nervous system response is it's intended to override rational thinking. This is not the place where we can have like nuanced conversations and like really get into it and hear other people. Here, we just want to either dominate what's going on or we want to get away as fast as we can. Luckily for us, the sympathetic nervous system, it's really good for us. It's helped us survive and evolve as a species. But when we're in like complex situations with other people that are threatening, we want to get out of that as quick as we can, because that's not where good decisions are made. That's not where the right conversations are had. That's where people do and say things they're going to totally regret. And I can imagine as board members must have seen times, as I'm saying this now, where they're like, oh, that makes sense why so-and-so did that time. They were probably having like a fear response, spiked their sympathetic nervous system, and they just attacked. It doesn't mean it's okay.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, absolutely. I mean, as you're talking, all of us, I think, can come up with some level of example, whether or not we've had a homeowner who was really upset about a situation, but there are typically added pressures that go into that. So you've defined for us that in that, we've got this fight or flight going through, right? And that's a response to, you had mentioned the phase of alarm. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. And like when we think, well, why isn't this person just seeing this like rational thing? It could simply be because they've got so much cortisol and so much adrenaline in their system. It just overrides rational thinking. But the thing is, that's a short-term response. And if someone is ignoring data, facts, and other things, that's actually another part that we'll talk about. So if they're doing that long-term and it's a repeated behavior, that's a whole other thing that we'll discuss in a sec. But short-term stress response, many of us saw that in others or experienced that ourselves in the beginning stages of this. Panic, fear, like really intense thinking of like, what am I going to do? We've probably made some decisions. We did some things that, like the people who literally bought like all of the toilet paper in the world. And we're not saying that in a negative way, but that is like a sympathetic nervous system response. So when our minds and our bodies realize that we're going to be in a longer term stress situation, we go into the second stress response. And this is actually where we want to be and we want to stay. So when I say that we're not built or we're not supposed to be in long-term stress, we're not. It's not what we're supposed to be doing. But our system can totally handle it if we stay in what's known as the resistance phase. So the resistance phase is our minds have accepted, I'm going to be this for a long time. So Amy, as you said earlier, Now we're here 6 months. It might be another 6 months. We don't have all the data. We're not sure what's going to happen. So our minds have said, okay, no problem. It's reduced the amount of cortisol that we have in our system, but it keeps just enough in that we can be really crispy, like we can be frosty, we can handle things. So it's here that we can focus really well. We can work longer than usual. We can problem solve really well. We can be in difficult conversations. We can pour ourselves into things. We can focus. And we can do this really, really well for long, long periods of time if we take care of ourselves. But taking care of ourselves is the key. And that's where probably in a community setting, we're starting to see some of the real cracks forming.
So you're giving me hope, right? The fact that we can operate still at a very high level, even though we're in this period of resistance. So tell me a little bit more about how do we navigate taking care of ourselves?
Yeah. It's a great question. So, and just to normalize this, in North America in general, people aren't used to living in the resistance phase. And that makes sense, right? We're very lucky in North America for the lifestyle that we get to lead. But people all over the world, if they live in countries that have a lot of political turmoil, a lot of civil unrest, if they have like a high level of, like, let's say, like war or anything like that, these are people who live in the resistance phase. And it is totally possible to live in the resistance phase with good, solid, strong practices. North Americans go through periods where we've had to live in the resistance phase. So for example, like when we had an economic downturn, or if we have any kind of significant social unrest, the thing is, we have all of that going on right now. Plus, we've got the pandemic. So it's good that we have the system. We can totally manage it, but we have to take care of ourselves, because without that, we go into our third phase, which is exhaustion. And that's where things get really, really serious for individuals and for a community. So let's talk about the basic tenets of self-care. If everybody can think about just drawing out a 4-quadrant grid, so just like a plus sign, a big plus sign. In the top left, what I'd like you to put is exercise. The top right, I'd like you to put diet. The bottom left, I'd like you to put sleep. In the bottom right, I'd like you to put social. And I'll do that again. Top left is exercise. Top right is diet. Bottom left is sleep. And bottom right is social. These are the pillars of self-care. And this is the oxygen mask that comes down. If you're someone who goes into a service position like a board member, it means you care about community. You want to help other people. And I could imagine it's like, oh, I'll take care of that for you, or I'll go and have that difficult conversation, or I'll go do that thing for you, or I'll handle this bad situation. Sure, because you care, and you probably do that a lot in your life. Maybe just like being in the mix and helping good decisions happen. But what's real interesting is people who find themselves in service positions, either because they do it for altruistic reasons or because they just like they like the idea of doing stuff. They like being involved. What we're talking about here has nothing to do with taking care of yourself. And that's where we fall down. So I'm going to encourage everyone here that vagueness is prohibitive of health. Vagueness is prohibitive of health. Those 4 areas that I just talked to you about, probably everybody here has some, I would imagine all of us have some kind of routine around them, but not a specific routine. And this is what I want to introduce you to. I have 3 Ds that I'm going to talk about today. This is the first of the 3 Ds, which is discipline. When I say discipline, I don't mean like iron discipline. I'm not asking anyone to go to the gym 7 days a week. But we have to have a very simple but specific plan for each one of these areas. And let me walk you through it. So when we say exercise, I am not saying exercise 7 days a week, doing some like ultra marathon. It can be that, but it's whatever you can do. You have to exercise minimum 3 times a week, at minimum for 15 minutes at a time. Exercise can be light stretching. It could be, doing some light weights and light cross training. It could be going for a walk, a hike. It could be running, biking, swimming, whatever it is. Minimum 3 times a week and minimum 15 minutes at a time. The thing is, you have to have a specific plan. When are you doing it? So what days a week? What are you doing? For how long? So when, what, how? When are you doing it? Identify the days of the week. Every single week, get the days of the week you're doing it. What are you doing? You running, you walking, you stretching. What is it? For how long? Once you have that, you've got one pillar of self-care, or one leg, because I want you to even think about this as a chair. When it comes to diet in this time, I don't know if you're anything like me, but when this whole thing set in, I gave myself permission to eat every single cookie that exists on the planet. Like if there was a cookie within my orbit, I ate that cookie. And like, I was seriously like eating a lot of cookies. And I put on a bunch of weight and all that kind of stuff. The thing about diet is it's okay to slip on diet. It's no big deal. We're people. But if we have to stay in our long-term stress response, if we're staying in resistance, we have to have our diet set. That means I'm going to ask you to think, how many times a day do I like to eat? So if I like to eat 3 times a day or 5 times a day or whatever it is, calculate how many times that is a week. Then 80% of those meals plan in advance. So calculate the number. I'm going to eat X amount of times this week. Okay, 80% of those I'm going to plan out. That means you plan out 80% of your meals that week. All I'm asking you to do is know what you're going to eat in a week, what days you're going to eat it, and then once a week, go and do your shopping so that you have all of the ingredients for that every single week. If you don't do it, if you're just like, I'm going to eat healthy, that's vague. And if you're vague, it doesn't mean you're not going to be healthy. But you notice there's an extra 20% there. Go wild. Eat all the pizza, have all the ice cream. It's totally fine as long as 80% of the time you've got that mapped out. Bottom left, sleep. All right, so I told you that in that space of being in resistance, we have less cortisol in our system, less stress, but we have just enough stress to keep us on edge at all times. When I say on edge, maybe not anxious, but you're in a state of readiness. A state of readiness is extremely difficult to get good sleep in. So many people are likely experiencing a difficulty falling asleep or disturbed sleep. So they're waking up multiple times at night, or they wake up early and they aren't able to fall back asleep. You might be experiencing all three, or you might be experiencing none of those. But what most people are experiencing is a lack of REM sleep. So a lot of people aren't getting into a deep, deep sleep. Getting into the REM state where you're like really asleep is essential to refresh our minds. Without doing that, we are charging towards exhaustion. So to be able to do that, we have to do the second D, which is distraction. So I got to ask first, your bedroom should only be for sleeping, or any other pursuit that's proper for the bedroom. You should not be watching movies. You should not be reading books. You should not be working. You should not be working out. You should not be eating in your bedroom at any time, but especially now. If you're doing any or all of those things now in your bedroom, it is not your sanctuary of sleep and relaxation. It is a flex room. So that messes with our psychology of sleep. But beyond that, when we're in resistance, our minds have a defense mechanism. And the defense mechanism is intended to keep us aware. So what it does is it picks things to ruminate on. So for example, it could be a difficult conversation you had at work, or a challenging situation you've had in the community. But what it always is something that you can't solve by just thinking about it. So sitting there, it's not like, what's this equation that you could reason out? Instead, it's something that can't be solved at all. And your mind will fixate on it. This is your mind doing what it's intended to do. By fixating on this thing, you're staying aware, you're staying ready to spring into action at any given time. Because your mind says, oh, no, if you relax too much, you're not going to be ready. And if you're not ready, then anything could happen. So this is part of the resistance phase, but we have to overwrite this part of the program. So the way that we do that is we practice distraction. And you need minimum 1 hour of distraction every single day. It's better if you practice distraction closer to bed, but you can kind of stack it up throughout the day, like almost like Lego, as long as you can fully connect to distraction. So let me tell you what distraction is. It's either the health food or the junk food of the mind. So for some people, it's meditating, like real deal meditation. Great, that's the health food. Or it could be a spiritual pursuit. So some people go to church, or they're part of an online sermon or whatever it is. That's the health food of the mind. As long as you can fully be carried away and you can truly be in the moment, you just let everything else melt away. Awesome. The junk food of the mind. It could be a romantic comedy. It could be a romance novel. The junk food of the mind sounds negative, but it's actually totally fine. It's like, when you eat like pie and it just feels right. It's okay. Think about the junk food of the mind. It's the things that people are typically a little embarrassed to talk about, like, oh, I'm really into romance novels, or I'm really into reality TV. I'm really into rom-coms. All of that is totally cool, as long as it is so junky that it just draws you in and you get lost. The whole idea about this is you want to find something that is either so healthy and so stimulating that you engage in it, or so ridiculous and so junky and just like, those kind of, this is hilarious, I'm so this, that it draws you in. You need a minimum of an hour of that a day for you to be able to have proper sleep at night. It unwinds your mind and it lets your mind feel okay to be relaxed. Now, if you're someone who has a hard time going to sleep, do this in at least around an hour to an hour and a half before going to sleep. If you're someone who has disturbed sleep, so you wake up in the middle of the night, keep a pair of earbuds beside your bed. This is the only time I'm going to encourage you to listen to things in bed or do that in your bedroom. Don't get out of bed and go about doing things if you can't sleep or if you wake up. If you get out of bed, your body's going to say, excellent, we're up. Instead, put in some earbuds and listen to something, either the health food of the mind or the junk food of the mind, something that draws you away from your thinking. Because that secular thinking that woke you up is now going to double and triple down unless you do something to draw you out of it. Put those in, drift back into sleep. If you're someone who wakes up early, do not get out of bed. And get out of bed to go to the bathroom, but don't get out of bed and then go about your day, or else your system is going to readjust and say, this is our new time to wake up, 4:30 in the morning. Put in earbuds, put on something that's healthy or distracting, and then you go away. And the last piece is social. So social, all human beings need social connection. And you might be someone who says, I don't actually need that. Yeah, maybe. Most people do, though. My job is people. So you might think I'm a super social person, but it's not true, because I talk to anywhere from 3 people to 300 people in a day, depending on what I do. I spend a lot of time with people. And I love people, but at the end of the day, I am tired. I am tired of talking. But I do know that I actually need to be around my friends and they need to be around my family. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do here is write out a list of your easiest friends, not your difficult friends, not your frenemies, not the people who might say passive aggressive things to you. I'm saying your easiest friends, your easiest family members. Write out a list and create a schedule where you are going through the cycle of spending time with them each week. You need to have at least 2 social engagements a week, better if it's 3. And it doesn't mean you have to go see people, but you have to either talk to them on the phone, talk to them on something like this, texting with them, go and see them, whatever that is. Create a schedule, and it's just like exercise. When am I going to do it? Who am I going to do that with? And like, what are we going to, and then finally, what are we going to do? You've got to have that really structured out. So if you do those 4 things, I want you to think about it like this. It's a chair. You can sit in a chair with only 3 legs, but it is a balancing act and you're super aware of it. That means you can't relax in the chair. And that does mean eventually you're going to topple over. You want your chair to have 4 legs, but that doesn't mean all 4 legs need to be the same length. And in fact, at any given time, one leg is going to be longer, the other one's going to be shorter. But if you have those 4 legs, you can sit in a chair for a long time. The best chair, the legs are almost all the same length, but that's not real life. Life is messy. But as long as you have 4 legs and none of them are drastically off of the other ones, you will be okay. And that will keep you in the resistance phase.
So as you're talking, you had shared with us from a personal perspective that food is that for you. You got that cookies are nearby. For me, as you were talking, it definitely spoke to me from the sleep aspect. So sleeping tends to be one of those things. And, there's that commercial at one point that was out there with Snickers where it coined the term being hangry, right? When you're hungry and you're angry at the same time. Well, there's this new concept now that there's something called tangry. You're tired and angry at the same time. I find myself deviating to that. So obviously I need to go back to my quadrant and take a look at my discipline on what it is that I'm doing in preparation for sleep. So I appreciate a lot of those tips and tricks that I can take home myself. And the reality is that you can certainly see too how they're interconnected, right? So when you start to lose one, Ram, you and I have talked before about when you start to lose one, it seems like some of the others start to fall too.
Totally. And so this is going to lead us to our last D, which is disruption. So in general, so we have all of these neural pathways in our mind. It's like how our brain works. And the thing is that we can develop new neural connections, or we can have neural connections decay. So in a time like this, where people are under prolonged stress, and the things that we're used to doing, I love to travel. I love to hop on a plane and go somewhere. And I like to go and do these things. Either we can't do them at all. Like I can't just go to the States now, or our ability to do them is greatly reduced. So yeah, I can hop in my car and go somewhere, but I'm going to have to bring masks and think about where I can go, what's open, what's not open. So for most people, our worlds are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that means problems that we usually are struggling with, they start to dominate our world. And it starts to seem like they are the only thing that we're focusing on, or they can become something that's a small problem. And it is a problem. It can dominate our mind like it's a crisis. And in those spaces, again, that's where our ability and willingness to be in the tough conversations with people, or even the not so tough conversations with people, get limited. We have to remind ourselves that we live in a big, beautiful world, and that there's lots of people that care about us, and that we care about people, and that people aren't bad. People aren't good, and they aren't bad. People are people, and they have complexities, just like each of us does. So we have to do disruption. So what disruption is I want to encourage everybody that at least once a week, I want you to do two things that are normal things you do, like whatever it is that you do for self-care. I do a lot of running. I do a lot of cycling. So twice a week, when I go running, I'll go running somewhere else in the city. I'll go to an area of town that I don't really know very well, that I'm not used to going to, and I'll run there. Or if I don't have time to do that, I'll just run a different direction than I usually run. So the whole idea, the first part of doing things that are novel is do things that are normal activities, but you're doing in a different way. So let's say for me, if I'm someone who's used to running flat, maybe I'll go run hills, or maybe I'll go and do some trail running, or maybe I'll just go to a totally different part of town and run, or I'll do something as simple as just run a different direction. But do your patterns of self-care, but try and do them in a different way at least twice a week, because that's a reminder that the world is actually bigger. The second thing is try once a week to do something totally novel to you. So something you haven't done before. And I'll give you an example. As I've told you, I have a terrible sweet tooth, and I really like pie. Like pie is my favorite thing. But I am only on the eating side of the pie business. I have never been on the making side of the pie business. And a good friend of mine the other day was like, hey, let's bake a pie. I have never baked anything in my entire life. I know that might sound bizarre, and we do have baking in Canada. I have just somehow skirted all baking in my life. So I'm going to bake a pie with a friend next week. And that's a novel activity. This week, I'm doing another novel activity. It's not about doing something totally wild. I'm not asking anyone to go skydiving here, but what I am asking you to do is just pick some easy new thing to do and do it at least once a week. So the 3 Ds again: discipline, distraction, disruption. If you practice those 3 things and focus on those 4 quadrants, you will be able to stay in the resistance phase. And that means you can meet the challenges in your community, your best version. It doesn't mean that you're going to show up totally crisp, but you're going to be able to stay in this resistance phase.
Absolutely. So all of those are some fantastic concepts. And as you're talking about them, Ram, you have historically talked about something called intrusive thoughts. For our audience here, I think we might have all experienced that at some point or another. Can you talk to us about the concept of intrusive thoughts?
Yeah, so intrusive thoughts it's like secular thinking that's intended to keep us on edge, right? To keep us active. Mm-hmm. So it's usually something not good, something that makes us feel bad, makes us feel threatened, something that like really gives us that icky feeling, and we just can't stop thinking about it. The thing about intrusive thoughts is they typically serve an evolutionary function, which is to keep us aware and crisp and ready to respond. But the interesting thing is we have these thoughts and we don't want to think them. So we try and push them down, and we have an inability to push them down. They come back up, and then we beat ourselves up about it. So then you have two layers of intrusive thinking. You've got the thought, and then you've got the bad feelings about the thought. And all of this is literally, from an evolutionary perspective, it's to keep you as crisp as possible. The difficulty about this is the more tired you get, and the closer you get to fatigue and exhaustion, intrusive thinking can become a false narrative, and it can become what's called a maladaptive response.
So can you talk to us a little bit about false narratives? Because I think that that's something that our board members can potentially relate to.
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, you might see patterns where people, they just won't look at the data. You can make a really clear argument for something or a clear positioning of something, and all of the data makes sense. Someone just literally cannot stick with it. So we have two kinds of responses. We have adaptive responses and we have maladaptive responses. Adaptive responses are when we can look at the data that's in front of us and adapt to it. A maladaptive response is when we can look at the data in front of us and completely ignore it and do something that is the opposite or a degree off of that data. And that's where we start adopting what's called a false narrative. And a false narrative is something like a whole new data set. It's a whole story. It's a whole idea. When I talked about othering falls into a false narrative where you create a narrative where any data that comes to you, you dismiss it because it's part of this like corrupted data source. And it allows people to kind of just act however they want or do whatever they want. And I have an example that I can share about me, if you don't mind.
Please, I would love it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a funny one. I have a funny relationship with my doctor, like my family doctor. And it's usually I go to my doctor and he says, "What did you do now?" Because, I've like lifelong athletics and I'm not claiming to be a good athlete. In fact, I'm quite clumsy and I've hurt myself several times. So the most ridiculous thing I've ever done is I was in Hawaii and I was there for a wedding, and my second day there, but I was training for a triathlon. So I had to go for a run, and I went for a run with my friend Oli. And as we're running along, I put my foot in a pothole by mistake and I clearly broke my ankle. But I broke the easiest bone to break in your ankle that doesn't at all prohibit the way your ankle works. So you can still walk on your ankle. But I broke my ankle. My ankle was super swollen. It was all black and white. It hurt terribly. And all of my friends did what they would do. "Oh man, you broke your ankle." And all of their friends did what they did. "Oh man, you broke your ankle. You should go to the hospital." I, being a Canadian in America, I don't have American healthcare. I don't want to pay X amount of money for my ankle. Being someone who likes to compete in things, I don't want to not do this triathlon. Being a guy who had never been to Hawaii before and was on vacation, I don't want to not be able to do all these things with my friends. I just decided in my brain that I just had a very bad sprain. And all I needed to do was stretch it every day, take care of it, but still do all of the things that I should do. And despite my ankle hurting terribly every single day, despite it being black and blue, I still did all of the stuff that I would do. And sure enough, I got home, the swelling eventually went down. I absolutely went and ran a triathlon. But for months, my ankle would just randomly swell up, would just randomly be very, very painful. So finally I went to my doctor, who said, "What did you do this time?" Took the x-rays and said, "Well, the good news is, yes, you did break your ankle, but luckily it just kind of miraculously healed the right way. So you're very lucky. The bad news is your entire body adjusted to take weight off your ankle. And now you've got a knee problem, now you've got a hip problem, now you've got a lower back problem, now you have a neck problem." And I had to go to rehab for a year. That was way more expensive than if I'd just gone to the hospital. So here's the thing. Despite this clear data, totally logical, clear data, and I have like a lot of history about like psychology and how the mind works. And I actually have a lot of history around like physicality and how things work. Even though I'm educated and experienced in that, I just chose to believe something because it's what I wanted it to be true. And it was a maladaptive response. And a maladaptive response in the narrative, the false narrative we create, is so powerful. It's so strong that it can become reality to us, even though it's not right. And that's the danger in general, people can do this, but when we are in a long-term stress response and people are afraid, they're nervous, they're not taking care of themselves, they're heading towards exhaustion, the maladaptive response and the false narrative taking hold can be incredibly destructive within a community.
And I could see where it would be very easy to make poor decisions from there, right, to your point. And so that false narrative, when you talk about that concept, I could see it playing a part in particularly team environment. When if somebody is in that arena and they're thinking, you know, maybe my team doesn't appreciate me, my team doesn't like me, my community doesn't appreciate me or value me. And those truly aren't valid or legitimate statements, but we're creating this false narrative and telling ourselves that that's what it is. And so it really helps us to start to question, look, do I have that going on with me right now, right? Is that something that we've got going on in our world? To potentially change those thought patterns and then ultimately change our behaviors. So thank you very much for offering that fun story. And how's your ankle today?
Well, listen, it's fine. Has my lower back gotten fully better from that? Absolutely not. So I just say, like, a false narrative can cause some real long-term damage.
Noted. Okay, so I do want to be respectful of some of our time for our guests that we've got tuning in. We do have a couple of questions that have come in from board members. And so I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to read those now, and we can take them from there. So the first question that we received is, we've noticed increased stress levels and tension within our own board of directors. How can I improve the balance so we can operate in a healthier environment? What is your initial thoughts on that question?
So this is a great question, and it's also very compassionate that you're thinking about other people. So first, I know this is going to sound redundant, but I ask, the best thing you can do for other people is make sure your 4 quadrants are totally lined up. How's your exercise? How's your diet? How's your sleep? How's your socializing? The more you put on your mask, you're better able to attend and help others. So that's the absolute first space. The second, I would be sharing these general practices with people. The third, I would 100% define and understand the difference between abusive interactions and challenging interactions. I want to encourage everyone, being yelled at and screamed at by people is completely unacceptable in any setting at any time. If people are doing things that are dangerous, negative, that are verbally threatening, physically threatening, any of these things, as a group, you have to talk about what do we accept within our group and what do we accept from people who might be speaking to our group. If you're experiencing something that anyone in your group is finding threatening, they should not be asked to face that thing again. We are in a very, very challenging time, and we have to reduce threats. It doesn't mean that we kick people off the island or kick them out of the group or kick them out of community, but it does mean that we get the resources for things get addressed properly. And that can be people, members doing it together, or bringing in outside resource, or partnering with other people in the community. So first, heavy self-care. And I encourage you to share everything we talked about with every other person that you know. Again, this is stuff that, although I've developed, I'm happy for you to share. Please do share with people. Take care of yourself, your care. Share this stuff with other people. Define what is abusive behavior that we will not tolerate versus what's a challenging conversation. And then the challenging conversation, we have to do a little bit of a look at ourselves of what's my role in that. Do I have a false narrative? Am I othering people? Am I showing up? Is my ability to maintain my emotional labor compromised right now? Do I have to do some work so that I have that I've managed it a little bit more, I've paid it a bit more?
Absolutely. And Aram, you touched on a really important topic right now, which is that level of abusive behavior, right? And I think for the most part, we can differentiate between an unhappy client or homeowner, right? And then you have something that's different, where there's some level of yelling, that level of intensity is just up to notch, right? They're two different things. You've got somebody who's upset about a situation and somebody else who might be behaving in consistent, repetitive repetitive type of behavior that's just inappropriate. And so I want to add on to that by saying that if you've identified that type of a situation, let's not avoid it. Let's not ignore it, particularly when it's somebody who we might respect and brings a lot of value to the table. We might ignore that type of behavior. But if you see that that's increasing in intensity, particularly for board members who are logged on here, I want to invite you to not ignore it, bring it to the attention of a team member, your manager. Let's talk about it and come up with resources, Aram, as you have suggested, to define how's the best way to work through that, right? But it's important now to not just accept that as a behavior that we just must take on as a result of what it is that we're doing. And I'm also not suggesting that you take it on yourself directly, right? Don't put yourself in that line of fire. Go back to your resources and let's make sure that we've got some support around you. So specifically talk to your manager about how to navigate those paths. If need be, escalate that to a regional director, because those are things that are worth investing the time to help address.
And if I could just speak to that for one more second, Amy, you hit on something that's super important. Some of us who are used to managing more emotional labor, so we're used to carrying that weight, it can be very compelling to be like, you know what, I'll just take that one. I'll just do it, everyone. You're not putting on your mask there. You are going to push yourself to exhaustion. Abusive behavior cannot be tolerated. It must be discussed. And again, we are human beings, so we don't want to put someone in a bad bucket and say, well, they're just like that. No. We have to have the conversation, but we have to figure out how we do it as a team, as a group, or do we get an outside resource? That's one piece. The second piece is we have to be very cautious of what's called a social contract. If we ignore people's behavior, we are creating a contract. And that contract essentially is all of us co-signing, saying, the rest of us won't do that, but that person, we're going to let them do that because it's easier. If we do that, if we create a social contract about extreme behaviors or abusive behaviors, we are creating a contract that's based on negative outcomes and the acceptance of that. And I'm going to tell you, the emotional labor that's a part of that, the intensity that's a part of that is creating a false narrative that we're agreeing to. It's a maladaptive response. So it's something to be really thoughtful of what kind of social contract are you agreeing to. Instead of a social contract, develop a working alliance. And a working alliance is, what do we agree and are identifying as abusive that we're not going to allow versus what's a challenging conversation that we have to bring our best selves to.
Right, and to take that to the next level, there's absolutely something that can be done about it to improve it. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong, right? We're not going to other that person that's going through it, but there's certainly some opportunity to have additional conversations about it. So the next question, Aram, that we have here is similar to the first one, but it takes a little bit of a different spin. It says, what should I do if I notice growing tension between our manager and our board? So the first one was internal tension between board members and board members. This shifts a little to say tension between manager and board members. And if you've got some initial thoughts on that, please let me know. And I have some organizational thoughts on that, right? So from an organizational perspective, we would want you to, of course, talk to somebody else within the team, right? So talk to your regional director, pull somebody in to say, look, I'm noticing that this is what's going on, because there might be more there to explore.
Yeah, I would, my suggestion is to do exactly what you just said. Bring in the additional resources. Don't take on an extra thing that has complexities. Bring in additional resources. When we're at a time of a little less stress, I would say, just bring it up. Just bring it up and have a human conversation. But what I would suggest now is try to avoid one more thing. Instead, just bring in the resources, like talk to the team, and then bring that forward. It's going to lead to a quicker and healthier solution.
Absolutely. So taking a quick time check, it looks like that's all the time that we have today. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thanks first and foremost, Aram, for providing your time with us and your valuable insights. Certainly appreciate that. Today's session truly was developed for the benefit of our board members, right? We've transitioned from this, how do we manage properties, into the space of let's make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and taking care of one another. So we hope that you take the valuable insight that you got this morning, and as Aram suggested, take it back, share it with your team, share it with your board members, your colleagues, even share it at home. So certainly encourage you to do that. I'd also like to say thank you to our First Service leadership team for understanding, appreciating the value of sharing these unique insights, and to our marketing team who's put together this webinar. So thank you guys for your time this morning, and thank you, Aram, for being here.
Thank you.